Right, ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you to the Faculty of Business and Management and the Research Seminar Series. You're very, very welcome. Today I'm Ruth Ashford and I'm standing in for Professor Claire Schofield, who can't be here. She's been called away, unfortunately, today. But it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jon Talbot, who is going to talk today about global perspectives in work-based learning. And I'm aware that you perhaps haven't seen the abstract, so I thought I'd read you a little bit from the abstract to help sort of frame where we're going for this presentation. So during the past 20 years, there's been a global shift towards vocationalism in education. This is evidenced by the rise of new forms of learning, variously described as work-based learning, WBL, work-integrated learning, work-related learning, and work-applied learning. For the purpose of the presentation, the term work-based learning is used, and it'll cover a wide variety of practices. And Jon has been on a journey throughout the latter part of his career, working through different countries and looking at work-based learning. And I think what this is a superb summary for you all, looking at different aspects from different parts of the country, which has informed Jon's new book that will be out, here's an advert, will be out in probably September.
Later this year.
But the key thing here is Jon wants to hand over the baton because there's more to do. So a second volume of this work-based learning book. So whilst Jon is talking, you might want to think whether you are the right person that wants to sort of carry on this and work on the second volume of this, this really important area of teaching and learning that all universities embrace very strongly now. And obviously the government is looking, and has been, for a number of years, which I'm sure Jon will tell you a little bit more about, work-based learning and its actual impact economically and on society. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jon. Jon's going to talk probably for about half an hour, and then we'll take questions, if that's okay. All right, over to you, Jon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. It's going to be a little bit strange because I've got to address a camera, and you're all on this side of the room, so you'll have to bear with me. I know most of you in the room probably know a little bit about work-based learning, but you probably don't know that much about WebOS, the Work-Based and Integrative Studies programme. Two of you certainly do, know it extremely well. And when I was first thinking about this, I didn't think, I kind of assumed the only people would turn up would be WebOS people, and I wouldn't have to explain it to them. So the first thing I'm going to do is just say a little bit about WebOS itself, how it works, how it originated, and what it can do. But for those of you who, as I said, who are not familiar with it, you should, you're in good company, because I know when I first started in Chester in 2004, I spent the first 2 years trying to understand it, what it was about. And I then spent a few years trying to figure out how it came about. So I'm going to say a little bit about some of the sort of intellectual underpinnings of WebOS, because just about every theory new theory of learning from John Dewey onwards in the 20th century has gone into WebOS. It's a synthesis of many theoretical developments, and it also incorporates a lot of innovative practices in pedagogic practice, such as formative assessment. Formative assessment is routine in WebOS. There are various other things as well, which, it's kind of absorbed everything that was considered radical and forward-thinking in education in the 20th century, and turned it into a practical learning project. So I'm going to talk a bit about WebOS to begin with, so you understand where I'm coming from in terms of my mindset, and why I've then gone on to try and understand a little bit about what's going on in the rest of the world. Most important thing to understand about WebOS is the key organising principle of education is subject, isn't it? You begin with a subject discipline. You decide what students need to learn. That's core. You then decide that there's some options that they could have, and then you tell them about it. And most of my career in education has been doing exactly that, telling students what we thought they needed to learn, and then assessing them on the basis of how well they repeated it back to us. Now, WebOS doesn't do that. It's a pre-accredited framework, so it's accredited in the same way as any other program of learning would be, but it doesn't have a subject. Instead, it's a framework for learners, whether that's an individual or an organisation, to create their own learning within it. So it gives you huge flexibility in terms of what can be accommodated. So the important thing to understand about it is it's negotiable. So that, I mean, I've written students here, but students, as I said, includes individual learners, but also cohorts, organisations. They negotiate their own award, whatever it is. You know, there's quite a lot of discussion about what is an appropriate award title. And then they negotiate with us their pathway within the WebOS framework. So it's a form of learning by contract. This is known as learning by contract. And learning by contract is something which was pioneered in the 1960s by a guy called Malcolm Knowles, who prior to that developed a theory of learning for adults. And essentially, according to Knowles, adults have got specific learning requirements which are different to those from children, in that adults wish to control and determine their own learning. So he had to devise practical means for that to occur. So WebOS is a form of whole program learning by contract. The other thing, because it doesn't start with the assumption of subject discipline, it doesn't assume that the knowledge which can be accommodated within a formal educational framework must also be formally codified knowledge. So it doesn't, WebOS includes disciplinary knowledge, interdisciplinary knowledge, and non-disciplinary knowledge. So it doesn't make the usual assumption about, in education we think the knowledge exists here and people come to us for it and we tell them and then they go away. WebOS recognises that knowledge is much more distributed than that. The other important thing about WebOS is, in education, we tend to assume that learning is something which occurs it's solely the province of the individual. So you're set an assignment, you as an individual, do your assignment or your exams, and we assess you individually. Now in WebOS, we still assess people individually, but we also recognise that genuine learning in the real world doesn't take place just within the individual. There's a social context in which learning occurs. So we always like our students to, whatever it is they think is appropriate for them to learn, to discuss it with their colleagues and particularly their line manager. So that not just that the people around them are aware of what they're doing, of what they're learning, but the aim really is to try and integrate it with their normal working practices. So it's a very different perspective that we have. And the other thing, I suppose, that's also quite different in WebOS is we don't think of knowledge as something that you simply store in your head and that you might draw upon at some future date. Knowledge is conceived of as something, is practice-based knowledge, is something that you can integrate your formal study and do something at the same time. Now, in education, we're not very good at thinking about doing, are we? We tend to assume that occurs somewhere else and it's got nothing to do with us. We've taught people all the things they need to know. It's up to them then to make sense of it. In WebOS, it's quite explicit that we are interested in application. Just a few words about the origins of it. Now, I said there's a sort of theoretical underpinning, and I've just mentioned Knowles and learning by contract, but there's the whole idea of reflective learning, situated learning, self-directed learning, all of these terms, all of these things go into WebOS. But we weren't the first people to have these kinds of thoughts. The origins actually go back to educational experiments in the early 1970s. I mean, we had a generation of educational reformers in this country in the 1960s, particularly, that created the polytechnics, that created the Open University, the world's first open university. And the spirit of experimentation was alive and well in North London Polytechnic, where they created a framework for independent learning, specifically for adults, but it was all subjects. So what it meant was that somebody could go into the Polytechnic, they could construct their curriculum based on the things they wanted to study, but they were all existing modules that they had to take. And there wasn't any real sort of rationale in terms of what those modules were. They didn't have to be, you know, you could do physics and engineering and English literature, it didn't really matter, mix and match. But that's the sort of origins of the practice. And that then sort of transmuted into, because some of the same people involved in that were also around in Middlesex, University of Middlesex later on. Middlesex University created the first, the form of learning by contract that we have work-based learning without a subject is known as a shell framework. The first one was created at Middlesex in 1996. It's still there. It's the only one that's really quite a bit like WebOS. But they, unlike North London Polytechnic, where it was all subjects, Middlesex went the other way. All of their modules are experiential. There's no subject modules at all. And virtually everybody who does work-based learning at Middlesex comes in and we have the facility in Chester to allow 2/3 of a qualification through past learning. In Middlesex, it's the same. Virtually every work-based learning student in Middlesex will make a claim for levels 4 and 5, and then they do level 6 through experiential learning. We're a little bit different. The key figure is David Major, who's now retired. David is a sort of lapsed theologian, and he was familiar with, he knew many of these people in Middlesex. He did his professional doctorate there, early professional doctorate. He brought what they had at Middlesex to Chester. It's revised in the sense that it still has experiential learning modules. That, in other words, not subject modules where you can create transdisciplinary learning projects in the workplace. But we also, within WebOS, have formal subject discipline modules. So we've got the WebOS students have got greater choice than they have in Middlesex. Those subject modules are ones which have been created by the WebOS team over the years. But it's also, if you're registered as a WebOS student, you can complete any module in the university, provided it's relevant to your studies and you take it in the way that it's delivered. So that's what the integrated bit refers to in WebOS, work-based and integrative studies. It is not just experiential learning as it is in Middlesex. It's integrated in the sense that it includes experiential learning, past learning, subject discipline learning if you want it, but it also describes a pedagogic method. In that in WebOS, what we're interested in is the dialogue between experience, lived experience, you've done something or you're doing something. What does the theory have to tell you about that? How does it inform your experience? The dialogue between theory and practice is at the core of the WebOS method. Just incidentally, there's a little story I'll tell you. The time this was first validated, 1998, we weren't an independent university in those days. We were a college of the University of Liverpool. And David Major had to go before the Liverpool Senate and explain this programme to him. Now, do you know this story at all? No. Okay. So there they were, all in their gowns and all the rest of it, and asking about it. And they said, frankly, Dr. Major, we don't understand this. We really don't know what you're talking about. But we believe you to be a gentleman, so we trust you to get on and make a job of it. Now, this is a true story. And if you know David Major is a gentleman. And the other thing I should say about WebOS is it's been 20 years since that program was created. It went from an initial 6 students to over 1,000 today. And it's been largely unmodified. So what was put down in 1998 really stood the test of time. And one of the things I have to say talk about is that many of the other programs which have started off like WebOS have almost in all cases fallen by the wayside, and that's been something that we've observed. There are things in WebOS which have enabled it to survive. We have this is a very Dave Perrin, those of you know Dave Perrin. Dave Perrin, who's the director of Centre for Work-Related Studies, loves ideology, the idea of ideology. And we have a professional ideology in Centre for Work-Related Studies. I hope my colleagues are going to agree. Part of it is derived from Boud Solomon's. These are people working in Middlesex who set out what they thought work-based learning is, and it's what you can see on the screen, a partnership with those outside the university. The learners are working. Learning is derived from the needs of the learner and the workplace, not from the requirements of didactic instruction. Learning is determined by ability and need, not formal qualifications. It's open access. Anybody can come. And we have had examples of people coming in without, in some cases, I think some people might have even come in without A-levels onto a bachelor and may have gone on to a master's program if we think they're capable of doing it. So there are no formal barriers to participation. Also, the idea that active learning occurs in the workplace. It's not something that occurs in a classroom as now, although I hope you are learning something. And the assignments are transdisciplinary. I perhaps need to say something about that term, transdisciplinary. If you think in terms of knowledge since the Enlightenment has been, one of the things that happened in the Enlightenment was that everybody started classifying everything all over the place, Linnaeus and all this sort of thing. And the same thing happened to knowledge. So knowledge became subject disciplines with subdisciplines and all the rest of it, and we kind of take that for granted. That's what knowledge is from the perspective of a university. We then got used to the idea of interdisciplinary knowledge and all of these other things. Transdisciplinary knowledge, as the term suggests, is the idea that knowledge is not all codified within disciplines. It can be within disciplines, between disciplines, but it can also be non-disciplinary. And if you just as an example, what Lee's doing at the moment, recording me, is based on all sorts of things, but it's certainly not disciplinary knowledge. The way we run a university, there's all sorts of things that we need to know to run a university, but it's not codified in disciplinary knowledge. It's practice-based. I've added to Boud Solomon the use of a shell framework, because in order to achieve those objectives, you need a shell framework like WebOS. There's no other way of doing it, of accommodating knowledge which is relevant to practice, knowledge generated in the workplace. You also need to be able to integrate experiential and formal learning, because we are in a formal educational setting. We are a university. We work within the confines of the European Qualification Framework. So we have to combine those two. It is not enough for people to have practical experience. We need to be able to add value using the forms of knowledge that we hold, the formal forms of knowledge, for our students. And so there has to be that integration of experiential and subject discipline learning. And I said the other bit that we've sort of added is this emphasis on application. Simply because if you start to think in terms of practice knowledge, which is what we're interested in, you cannot separate out practice knowledge from application. You don't know things for purely theoretical reasons. We don't know things about running a university for theoretical reasons. We know them because we intend to act upon them. So WebOS has that built into it. Now, as I said, during my lifetime here at Chester, I spent the first couple of years just trying to figure it all out, find out where it came from, who did this, who did that. And then I started to look around to see who else is doing it. Because I have to tell you, from my perspective, this is the best thing I've ever seen in education by a country mile. It is absolutely bloody, it's a work of genius. You know, hats off to David Major, it really is. You know, there are lots of people who write very learned books about practice knowledge and formal education and adult learning who have no idea that all of the problems that they discuss in theoretical terms have been solved practically by this synthesis. And part of the problem, you know, we're a small provincial university. We've spent most of our time just trying to keep the students coming through, and we've had next to no time to tell anybody about it. So we're almost invisible. I mean, I'm glad to say that's changed. We now get a sort of regular stream of visitors who come to see what we do. We are asked to go around the world to tell people what we do. So it's gradually the word is getting out. But you know, having seen this thing, and I thought this is just so good. It does what people want. I thought, who else is doing it now? For a number of years, I mean, I have to say also, I share this WebOS ideology, and for many years I thought that's what work-based learning is. Okay, so any thoughts that it might be something different didn't occur to me. So I was looking around to see who was doing it. The people who were doing it, many of those who started in the 90s quickly faded away. Some of the other major providers, it used to be the big three providers were Middlesex, ourselves and Derby. Derby now don't do individual learning, they don't have a framework, they just do sort of traditional corporate learning where they deliver lectures to companies, that kind of thing. Many others have disappeared. A lot of people have tried to start a framework up. They did it at Salford, they did it at Huddersfield, they did it at Lincoln, a number of universities, and it just hasn't worked for various reasons. So we're kind of survivors in a field littered with corpses, okay? So it's been a bit depressing in that sense. And I started looking around, and when I first came here, I was involved quite a lot with the Commonwealth in various guises, and I couldn't find anything like us anywhere else in the Commonwealth. There wasn't anything in Australia, for example, where I expected to see it. And David Bood, who went from Middlesex to Sydney in the hope of taking work-based learning with him in the sense that we understand it. I remember 2009 hearing him stand up and saying, I failed. It's not there. Not in the sense that we have at Middlesex and we have here, that flexibility. So the next stage was Europe. What do they do in the rest of Europe? Well, they do all sorts of interesting things, but they don't do this. I can't find it anywhere. I can find all sorts of interesting developments in countries like Finland, and the German-speaking world of higher education is adapting for sure, but they don't have anything like WebOS. They don't have that flexibility. They don't have shell frameworks. They haven't got it. So I thought, well, it must be in America. Right? The Americans are, you know, that can do, you know, these are the kings of innovation. These are the people who, you know, well, Germans invented the modern university, the Americans invented the PhD, they invented the credit system, or, you know, they must have it. They invented experiential learning, you know, they've had it since the 1930s, credit for past learning. I'm afraid they don't. They have things similar, but they do not have the non-disciplinary shell frameworks that we have as in WebOS. So I was a bit disheartened, but 3 years ago I did a little survey. I was interested in MOOCs. You remember MOOCs, the year of the MOOC, 2012 I think it was, or 2013, the bubble burst after that. But I wanted to know, I had my first student who presented a MOOC certificate as the basis of a claim for past learning. So I thought, I wonder how many other work-based learning universities would do that, would take a certificate, which is just from automated assessment, and say, yes, that's the basis for a claim for past learning. So I had a hunt around, and much to my surprise, I discovered that there were 43 universities in England and Wales who had something called work-based learning. And this is the biggest surprise of my life. I thought it was kind of dying on its feet, and it turns out actually quite a lot of people are doing it. They might not be doing it in the way that we're doing it, but the term is recognised and there are various varieties of practice. Now, you probably can't read that. Not sure what it looks like. For some universities, for 13, this is the 25 who responded, 13 universities, it simply means work placements. Okay, so they're just sending people out on placement. For 16, the work-based learning modules exist within a defined curriculum. So they'll have, a regular approach to the curriculum, and then there'll be a module called work-based learning, something like that. Then there are people who've got a sort of curriculum-based, pretty traditional approach to the curriculum, but it's been negotiated with an employer. Okay, they call that work-based learning. Then there are people where it's negotiable, and the curriculum is based around work-based learning modules. And then there's ones like ours which are fully negotiable with students, individual students and employers, with work-based. Sorry, the last one is like Middlesex, where they're purely experiential, and the last category is 13 universities have got something like with us, experiential and subject discipline modules. Now, these questions I wasn't expecting anything. It's when you do a survey, you do a few sort of, classifying, a few, that's all it was. I just wanted to know what people were doing. I wasn't really thinking too hard about it. And then I also asked how many students do you think you've got off the top of your head? I didn't ask, if you're asking people questions, if it's a question they have to go and look up, they won't bother. So you've got to ask them something that they can just tick a box and that kind of thing. And much to my surprise, 11 universities have more than 1,000 students doing work-based learning. I didn't ask them how many. What's even more interesting about it is this excludes the Open University. And I don't know if anybody knows much about the Open University these days, but it's becoming quite a work-based institution. The Open University, for much of its existence, has been really about leisure learning. As you know, when the funding was there, people like us would retire and do a degree in art history. That was pretty much what used to happen. Since the removal of funding for second degrees, they've had to reorient what they do. And now the Open University is they haven't upgraded their regulations, so they've got no facility to recognise past learning, things like that. They're very traditional in lots of ways. But there's an awful lot of work-based learning that goes on in their modules, and they have huge numbers. So it made me realise, one of the things about work-based learning, is it is not a subject recognised by HESA, the Higher Education Subject Authority. Okay, so it's invisible at a national level. Nobody knows, nobody's done a survey, nobody's done a study to see how much of it's being done. The figures aren't collected. But the story it's telling me is that things are spreading much more than any of us here thought. People might not be doing it in the way that we thought proper work-based learning should be done, but it's certainly spreading. It's also starting to replace some of these other terms that you might have come across: work-integrated learning, work-related learning, work-applied learning. Work-integrated learning in particular has got a long history, and it essentially refers to a sort of work-placed element on a traditional business program, typically. So a work placement, that's really what it means. But the term is going global. You hear politicians referring to it. I heard a few weeks ago at the University Association Lifelong Learning Annual Conference, I heard Nicola Dandridge, who's the head of the new Office for Students, use the term work-based learning. I'm not sure if she knows quite what she means by it, but it's sneaked under the radar. It's become part of the lexicon, become part of the language. And so this is what's led me to say, right, well, I better go out and see if I can capture it, find out what it is. And as Ruth mentioned at the beginning, this is the basis for a book called Global Perspectives on Work-Based Learning. What are other people doing? What are they calling it? And I can use that term to people in Africa, in China, in Japan, in the USA. They all use the term. It has some meaning. In Korea, it has currency. So far from our sort of WBS perspective, I need to rethink what I mean by work-based learning. And the starting point for me is a very, very simple one, and it's the UNESCO definition: all forms of learning that take place in a real work environment. Okay, I like that. Especially when work-based learning started to take off in the 90s, there was a sort of minor industry in the academic literature about a definition, as often happens. And I've counted at least 50 of them. Okay, there's lots and lots, because it's something you can write a paper about, isn't it? We're doing it, this is what it means, all the others are rubbish. I can criticise this, that and the other. But that is a nice, simple definition. The whole world can live with it. And then we can start to think about what it means. One way of, so it means all levels of education. So not just higher education we're in. I'll talk a little bit, give an example of non-HE work-based learning in a minute. It can include formal learning. We do formal learning in university. Informal learning is day-to-day, experiential, unplanned, learning on the job stuff that we all do. When we come into this business, we have to learn how to manage a classroom and all the rest of it. That's how we do it, isn't it? We learn experientially. And then non-formal learning. Non-formal learning is planned, is structured, but it's not credited. Okay, so it's the sort of things, company in-house training schemes, doing a MOOC. Okay, professional CPD, you go and attend an event. This is CPD, isn't it? This is an example of non-formal learning. Okay, so work-based learning can incorporate all of those things potentially. It also, it can be at different levels, it can incorporate different types of learning, and it can also be in countries where there is strong central direction or very little, like England. Although the term is used, and politicians use the term, there is no official document that you can point to. There is no strategy. There is no plan. There's no recognition of it. Unlike Wales, where there is. Complete opposite in Wales. The National Training Federation for Wales has over 100 organisations. It's in touch with 35,000 employers. It's all sub-HE, so it's a lot of apprenticeships and company training programs and all the rest of it. It's funded by the Welsh Assembly Government. They link into the Welsh Assembly Government to feed back the views and interests of the employers and the organisations that they work with. They have conferences. They have workshops, they have a newsletter, they've got a website, etc. So in Wales, they do it differently to England. I would say a lot better. But they only do it, there is work-based learning at higher education level in Wales. There's a bit in whatever, I can't remember what that university is called in the southwest, Trinity Lampeter and Swansea Met, whatever that became. Trinity something or other it became. They do a bit there, and they do a bit in the University of South Wales. But it's not really very well developed in HE, but it's well developed in FE. And as I said, it's centrally funded and directed. So that's one way you can think about it. The involvement of the state, the awareness of the state, the interest in trying to create learning which is more relevant to workplace practice. Another way of defining it is to think in terms of the relationship of the students to the labour market. And there's three types that you can identify. First, there are, and I'll run through some examples of these, and then that will be it. A few concluding thoughts. First is work-based learning for those people outside the labour market. Okay. Then there are learners who are partly in the workplace, partly in an educational institution, and then there are programs designed for learners in full-time employment, which WBS is. So WBS comes into that final category. Learners outside the labour market, there are two types of those really. There are programs aimed at younger people in full-time education, and in fact this is what most of the world thinks work-based learning is. Okay, it's something that you have as part of your educational program, a placement or internship or something like that, mentoring. But there are also programs for older people who've been made redundant and which are designed to try and get them back into the labour market. So that's the first category. A few examples. Not the first country that springs to mind, is it? Nigeria, when you think of work-based learning. But yes, they do have some. It's centrally directed, so the government there takes an interest in it. The author of my chapter says it's completely chaotic and doesn't work, but nonetheless, you know, there's willing there. And they have 2 graduate internship programs, basically allied to vocational subject areas. Okay, that's a common feature of work-based learning, that if you're doing a vocational subject, you'll do a placement. We're a little bit unusual in Chester in that our work-based learning module for our second year students doesn't insist on you having studied a vocational subject. We put all students through it, don't we, irrespective. I know, you know, there's always been resistance from English and places like that, but it's not a prerequisite in Chester. So that's one case. The US, by contrast, no central direction whatsoever. They did briefly have a Schools to Work Opportunities Act from 1994, which provided federal funding to fund placements for high school students. In other words, pre-university students to go off and get some work experience. And work-based learning in the US is thought of as being something which happens in high school. Right? You're in your final year of high school. Before you graduate, then you're likely to be offered the opportunity of a work placement. And that's what it tends to mean. But practice is very fragmented because in the US, as in this country, education institutions are highly autonomous. So there isn't that sort of consistent state push. There is some practice within universities, but it's not called work-based learning. One of the most interesting examples is in Northeastern University. Now, Northeastern University is interesting because it's where Joe Raylan, who's one of the best-known authors on work-based learning, is a professor. But they don't have work-based learning programs there. But what they do have is they have business and management programs which have work-based learning in them, experiential learning, by another name. So their programs are quite work-based. There's a lot more practical experience in their business programs than in most. So it's kind of influencing the practice without being called that, simply because in the US it means something else. This thing about definitions. Just one example of assist work-based learning for people who are unemployed. This was a program which ran in Greece from 2007 to 2013 till the money ran out. Okay, they can't even afford to do these things now. And it's a nationwide program. They had some European money as well to get people back into work. And it seems to have made people feel better. But I put limited success mainly because not many people got jobs out of it, because there aren't many jobs in Greece, probably not, rather than the quality of the program itself. Right, second category, the learner is partly in the workplace, partly in education. And here we're talking about apprenticeships. And interestingly, the OECD and the EU both equate work-based learning with apprenticeships. That's what they assume they are. A couple of years ago, I went off to CEDAFOP in Greece to explain that there are other forms of work-based learning. It's not just apprenticeships and all the rest of it, but not that they took a blind bit of notice, but you know, it goes to show that they were willing to listen. Couple of examples here. Actually, they're not well chosen because they're pretty similar. Germany and the Netherlands are very similar. Has everybody heard of the German dual system? It's very famous. All right, okay, I thought it was... it's, the dual system is the split that's made between academic and vocational education in Germany. And it's particularly famous for the very strong apprenticeship system that it's created in Germany historically. You know, historically the UK has been very good in universities and still very good in universities and really poor in sub-degree vocational education. We still are. Germans are very, very strong in it. And it's called the dual system. And historically, work-based learning has been seen as a sub-degree apprenticeship. But in the last 20 years, they've really significantly changed. And so universities are now no longer exclusively academically oriented. There's two types of universities now. There are in the same way we used to have the divide between universities and polytechnics. Germans have academic universities, and then they have universities of applied sciences, which are purely vocationally and professionally oriented. And about 40% of German graduates will go through that route. So they will go to an explicitly, and while they're in those universities, they'll spend a significant amount of their time in the workplace learning experientially. They've also developed what are called dual study programs. These are in some of the academic universities as well. And this is where the student spends half the time here in the university or college, half the time in the workplace. And the Netherlands is pretty much the same. They have this dual system, and they've created their own vocational universities and dual programs. What about learners in full-time employment, work-based learning there? It's the UK. I can't find anywhere, unless and until somebody tells me different, I can't find anything else out there outside of the UK. And I'm not sure. Sometimes, there's a sort of theory, isn't there? First in, first out, and all the rest of it. This country industrialised 60 years before anybody else, and it wasn't the product of a central government. The Germans planned their industrial revolution, the French planned theirs, everybody planned theirs. We didn't. It kind of happened, and work-based learning, in the WebOS sense, has kind of happened. Not only were we the first to industrialise, we were the first to start to deindustrialise. Manufacturing employment. 1966 wasn't just the year England won the World Cup. That's when we started to lose jobs in manufacturing. We've been doing it a long, long time. And I do wonder, when you talk about WebOS and the flexibility and things it does, to my way of thinking, that's what makes it in tune with the modern world. In a world where we emphasise lifelong learning, where there's continual change, where there's knowledge exists in many situations, not just in the academy, WebOS makes perfect sense. It wouldn't have made much sense 40 years ago or 50 years ago in industrial society. And in lots of ways, I think when you think about universities themselves, they are a product of an industrial age. I mean, I have to tell you, for those of you who don't work in CWRS, from where we sit, the rest of the university looks like a car factory. Right? Because you have a standard intake which are processed in a standard way through standard bureaucratic processes, and they come out at the end with their 2.2s and 2.1s in generic subjects. Very industrial, isn't it? And I do wonder, when we think about why is it that we're doing this in the UK, uncelebrated, unrecorded, unremarked, you do wonder if it is something to do with that process of deindustrialisation and the way that the modern world is going. The interesting thing about that, I could have added to that list. I put Lancaster there. Was anybody surprised at that? You wouldn't think it, would you? We, just last week, we've had a lady from the business school in Exeter who wants to come and see what we do, because they're kind of interested in doing something like it in Exeter Business School. Exeter Business School is very highly regarded. Yeah? We have something here that other people are interested in. And I think that, there is an assumption in universities, isn't there, that universities are social climbers. So they all want to be Oxbridge and get the ivy on the walls and, turn the back on the students, do research and all the rest of it. It's quite interesting, I think, that in areas like this, it's institutions like this which will be the tail that wags the dog. We have been able to do things and innovate in a way that more traditionally minded universities simply have failed to. All right. A few final thoughts. Although work-based learning has entered the language, not everybody likes the idea of work-based learning. At Kent, they don't like it. They call it work-related learning. They do quite a lot of it. Again, you might be surprised at that. It's quite a good university, but they do quite a lot, but they don't call it work-based learning, and they're very particular about it. And at Middlesex have long been the brand leader. They are in serious trouble. They have a separate institute which has been broken up. They've been sent out into different faculties. Each faculty is going to create its own framework. I'm pleased to say most of them want to do something like WebOS rather than what they've got. They want to bring subjects back in. Okay, but work-based learning is under severe threat in Middlesex. And some people there think it's the term work-based learning because it implies trade and all the things that we're not supposed to be associated with. Yeah? I don't agree with them, but you know, the term itself does upset some people, just as apprenticeships does, doesn't it? Some people think that implies, you know, greasy overalls and, you know, spanners and things like that. And the fact that the University of Cambridge are going to do apprenticeship, I think will change a lot of attitudes. And I think, you know, when we talk about what's happening globally, we're describing a gale in favour of vocational experiential learning. So I think myself, although not everybody likes the term, I think it's here to stay, and I think it's in the process really of, I wouldn't say vanquishing, but rather overshadowing the other terms that have been used for this form of education. So the pressures to create forms of work-based learning are universal. It's going on everywhere. What's interesting is we have all three types here, don't we? Almost uniquely. We have the work-based learning module, the students going out doing placement. We have traditional WebOS, but we've now got WebOS for apprenticeships, where the students are, you know, they are full-time students as well as being employees. So we are in a very good place in Chester for progressing and developing this. As I said, my final question, if WebOS is so bloody wonderful, why is there so little of it? You know, it is I don't know. I mean, I think partly, I mean, it's our 20th anniversary, we've had a chance to think through why we've been able to survive. And when you start to think about it, because I've talked about pedagogy, and that's what we tend to talk about as academics, what I haven't spoken about is the quality of leadership, because we've had outstanding leaders in David Major and now Dave Perrin. We've made money, which I should also say something, the Vice-Chancellor has allowed us to do it. That doesn't happen everywhere. People get, you know, somebody comes in, they don't like it, right? We've been here almost the same time as the Vice-Chancellor. He's allowed us to do it. But we have done the things that he wants us to do. We've brought students in, we've brought opportunities, we've brought money. Okay. We also have a very cohesive community of practice. We work together. It is a community of practice. We've always been very, very, one of the issues with this style of learning, anything non-standard, people will look at it and think that there's a problem with academic standards. It's the first thing people think. You know, you're going to hell in a handcuff. And it's not, it simply isn't that way. And we've always had to be very cute about academic standards. The last institutional review, QAA, 2010, when they came here to the university, they spent most of their time looking at WebOS because it's non-standard. And there was fear in the rest of the university that we were going to be damned for it. There was a lot of nervousness about it all. And in fact, the opposite happened. There were two programs commended by the QAA in that review, WebOS and Wibble, as being outstanding examples of practice. So it's had to withstand that kind of scrutiny. So it's not enough to have pedagogical innovation. You need a lot of other things. I mean, the other thing I probably ought to say, and I'll finish on that note, because it's implicit in what I've said, is that we have a focus on learning, but the other focus is on business. We function like a business. We look to use opportunities to market. We have a monthly meeting where we're talking about, we have two monthly meetings, one on learning, one on business. And there is a constant dialogue about how we can bring people in, how we can keep them. That doesn't often happen in academic life. And I always say, Dave Perrin is an interesting chap, those who don't know him, because I always say he's Britain's only cricket-loving Marxist. This is a Marxist who reads Investors' Chronicle. Right? It's the utopianism and the pragmatism that's enabled it to flourish, in my view. Not just the pedagogy. Right, that's it. So I don't know how long that was. It was longer than I, sorry, it was a lot longer than I thought.